Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Lewis Hassel, Professor of Pathology at the University of Oklahoma Health Sciences Center, and welcome to one in our series of topics on laboratory management that can save lives. Tonight, we'll be talking about risk management and some of the issues associated with that as it pertains to medical laboratories. One of the things that's become clear to me over the course of my interaction with various medical laboratories in my career is that risk is something that is always with us, and mistakes do happen. But there are a lot of things that can be done to minimize the severity of those risks and to minimize the economic and personal results of those risks that we inherently deal with. So as we talk about that, let's first ask, what do we mean by managing risk? Well, primarily this is becoming aware of what in our environment poses a risk to our patients, to our staff, and so forth. And then designing a system that will prevent and minimize those risks or allow us to detect them early and hopefully correct them before they have resulted in further damage or risks. So what kind of risks are we talking about? Well, I've mentioned the patient safety risks that were, of course, evident. That can be in the form of diagnosis or results. It can be related to obtaining or dealing with the wrong kind of specimen or managing the specimen improperly and so forth. Reporting errors, improper reference ranges, all sorts of things like that can affect patient safety. Additionally, there are risks to the laboratory personnel, the way they're working, the equipment they're working with, the kinds of protective equipment that they have, or the inherent risks with chemicals, reagents, and so forth also are risks that need to be managed. And likewise, there are potential public safety risks associated with laboratory work. Oftentimes, these are regulated based on the type of risk, whether it's environmental toxin, whether it's an infectious agent, or so forth. But these also need to be managed in our safety plans and in dealing with an overall approach to risk. Additionally, there are certain kinds of operational risks. These often have impacts on a technical or procedural basis, but the technology we employ may become outdated. That's a risk. We may have to develop new technology or acquire new technology to continue to operate. Likewise, employing the wrong kinds of procedures or having the wrong kind of physical plant can result in injury or accident that is improper as well. There are, of course, financial risks involved with laboratory operations that can also be detrimental to certainly the economic life and sustainability of the laboratory, as well as all of the employees and patients who depend on that laboratory. And finally, there are a variety of risks that often are not included in typical risk management, but may include things like floods, fires, or other environmental events, such as earthquakes and so forth, that need to be accounted for and considered in terms of operational planning and preparation for potential downstream effects. So one of the things that's inherent in this is that the culture of an organization is really critical to how we're going to be able to manage, reduce, or eliminate various risks. I'm not going to give a lengthy talk here about cultural values and so forth, but I want to emphasize that cultural transparency and trust within the organization are highly essential to being able to do this well. So how do we do that? Well, there are various other elements that are involved with organizational culture that need to be considered. But essentially, culture is kind of the operating software that's inherent in your organization that says who you are, what you're going to do, how you communicate that, how you interact with one another, how you interact with your environment, your clients, your public, and so forth. and the kind of benefits and interface that you have with the people, employees that work in your organization. All of that create a climate. And managing errors, and so forth, is a critical part of that. And one thing that in particular is important in developing a risk-averse culture is avoiding any kind of blaming. So this last item here is blaming and so forth is not going to, blaming individuals is usually not going to lead to development of a robust and healthy risk-averse culture. Yes, there will be very averse to having any sort of risk or event reported, but that cuts you off at the knees in terms of being able to learn. And so you have to have these incident reporting systems. You have to have a process to respond to various kinds of incidents that may occur. And you need to have the awareness of the near miss events, the almost sorts of things that could have caused you harm. And all of this depends on having a very engaged leadership team and an engaged employee base that is working on this as well. Because you really can't do this in isolation. This really is a team sport, laboratory working, and so forth. So you need to have everyone engaged in that process. So if we think about how we're going to go about hunting down the risks in our organizations, how we're going to collaborate to minimize those sorts of things or slay them if we need to think about certain things. So one of the best ways to begin to hunt down where your risks are is to look at what kind of baseline data you have, primarily from incident reports, but also possibly from your quality data, from your proficiency testing experience, and the overall impact of your quality management system. Having that quality management system in place can inform and provide data for that effort to identify target areas where you're prone to mistakes, where you're prone to errors that may pose risk. Additionally, you can inspect your processes and think critically about them from the risk perspective. And primarily here, we use three categories, the pre-analytical phases, the analytical phase, and the post-analytical phase, to evaluate the different kinds of errors that can occur and look to see what we can do to influence those prior to them coming back and biting us. We also want to inspect our environment, look at the kind of materials that we're working with, what kind of technologies are employed, and what risks may be specific to that. Of course, there are many safety or other kinds of risks involved with that, so much of this may have been already identified. You also want to look at your physical operation, where the risks to patient interactions or employee risks for infection or toxic exposures and those kinds of things that will help you to do that. If you live, obviously, in an earthquake-prone environment, being aware of that and what you might have to do in the event of an earthquake that would impact your facility. Likewise, there are certain kinds of market or fiscal risks that need to be evaluated: the stability of your paying population, the fiscal health of your parent organization, your hospital or laboratory. And then as you do all of these things, you have to then begin to prioritize. And in order to do that, it's very helpful to evaluate the likelihood of any of those sorts of errors or incidents occurring and the potential severity of their impact on your operation. And then as you do that, you can then begin to say, well, this is a very highly severe risk and a very high likelihood of occurring, so it should be close to the top of our list of things to prioritize and tackle first, because you can't do everything all at once. Likewise, it's very important as we go through this process to learn from the experiences that others have had. And to do that, you need to be aware of the literature, you need to be talking to your peers, you need to be looking to see what standard operating materials are in your particular area. Sometimes your institution may have a tool such as this, which I gleaned from the web of one similar institution to mine, which offers a very broad range of laboratory hazard assessment tools. And this includes things like ergonomics, environmental issues, and then a whole host of various laboratory safety things, depending on the kinds of equipment that you may be dealing with, and so forth. If you have lasers, if you have liquid nitrogen, and the page went on and on with a number of other things. But if you're the lab director or the principal investigator, then looking at all of those various hazards and how they may impact your workers is important. As a laboratory director or manager, you also then have to look at those hazards vis-a-vis any patient exposure or toxic public exposures that may be aware there as well. And so a tool like this can help you to identify and then begin to gauge your response to those kinds of risks. There are other risk mitigation tools, and we'll talk about some of these as we go through the talk. I'm not going to go in detail into any of these, but each of these plays a role in reducing or mitigating risks. That includes your written procedures, your proficiency testing, we've mentioned that, various kinds of checklists, timeout habits, and the appropriate frequency of quality checks, accreditation, inspection, and so forth. Really starts at the beginning, though, as you design your processes, because we're aware of certain kinds of risks up front. And designing processes and using tools to minimize risk from the very beginning is important. Certain business tools such as Six Sigma and Lean have been very useful in this. A tool called the Failure Modes Effects Analysis, FMEA, likewise is useful. And then, of course, there are things such as insurance, quality safety committees, and so forth that can take on these responsibilities and help to mitigate risk as well. So a few years ago, the world was quite stunned when this report from the Institute of Medicine came out, titled very appropriately "To Err is Human," but detailing that there were certain kinds of risks that were not being accounted for, leading to an enormous number of deaths and patient morbidities in the medical community. And so looking at ways that we could build a safer health system became critical, with the goal to eliminate certain kinds of risks. And in our hospital, for example, there are certain never events that never occur because we have determined that we will eliminate them and designed our procedures such as to accomplish that. One example is wrong site surgery. Now, that's not a laboratory issue, but there may be certain kinds of never events that you should identify for your laboratory as well. In order to do this, you need some sort of tool to help you identify problems as they are arising. And this is usually in the form of some sort of an incident identification system. And that can be a paper-based system, or it can be a shared system with your overall institution. It can be a unique laboratory method, maybe even just as simple as a spreadsheet or something of that nature. And that has to be followed by timely investigation using some of these sorts of tools, root cause analysis, failure mode effects analysis, and so forth, and developing the appropriate response. That response may, in certain situations, include patient disclosure of the error and the remedial actions that have occurred as a consequence, particularly if a severe patient impact is anticipated. Well, this leads me to mention that there are certain software tools that are out there and available. I'm not going to review all of these. There are leads such as this that can give you clues or links to some of the best software systems that have been evaluated by other users, both for overall risk management as well as for incident management as well. Primarily, this harks back to the culture that's involved. You want to have that leadership and safety culture involved that is going to be eager to respond to these events. Eager in the sense that we want to embrace these kinds of things as an opportunity for learning, as an opportunity for improving, rather than as an, oh no, who's going to be fired as a consequence of this particular error. So as these are logged or entered into your system and reported to the appropriate people, that then triggers the evaluation and the analysis of the situation using some of the tools we've mentioned and others that maybe you may have access to. Then you begin your remedial response, the kinds of actions to minimize the immediate impact on patients or workers, but then to also begin to evaluate your systems and to implement the kind of systems changes that will prevent future events of a similar nature. And the final step, also very important, is communicating what you're doing to your team, to your workers, occasionally to the patient or the public if they are impacted by these kinds of events. So I'd like to share with you one such event to further illustrate this. So in our hospital, some years ago, or at least the hospital I was working in at the time, we had a patient's prostate removed. And on evaluation of that prostate, we could find no reason for that prostate to have been removed. It was healthy. Despite extensive sectioning, we could not identify any cancer. And so that may sound like great news for the patient, except that they came to the hospital expecting that they had prostate cancer. And to have had this surgery without the identification of a cancer sounded a little bit suspicious. And so we began to ask some questions. What did this patient's biopsy show? Well, we went back to that report, and sure enough, the biopsy showed cancer. Was this specimen really from the patient who had the surgery? Well, that investigation, asking that question, led us to do some genetic testing. And in fact, the resection sample did not match the biopsy sample genetically. So it could not have been from the same patient. Uh-oh, what does that mean? Well, it means there's someone out there who has cancer but may not know it. So we began to look back at how the sample was labeled and where it came from to see what could have happened. Where could the switch between the patient whose biopsy showed cancer and the patient whose resection did not show cancer happen? As it happened, we identified two samples that came from the same surgeon on the same day and were evaluated and processed in our laboratory. As we investigated, it turned out that that second patient's tissue matched the tissue that was resected. How did that happen? Could the laboratory have been somehow responsible for switching the sample, or did it happen somewhere else? Well, because of the way and the nature of the laboratory procedures, we felt and we discovered that it would be virtually impossible for those two patient samples to have been switched within the laboratory. And in fact, as we investigated and queried the surgeon and his office staff, it became evident that they were in the habit of pre-labeling their sample vials for the patients they were going to see that day. Well, then we asked, why did you do that? Well, it makes the surgeon more efficient. The nurse has little time between patients to label samples. We also asked, was any timeout performed to verify patient identification, labels, and so forth? And in fact, no timeout procedure was performed. So we began to understand from that investigation how this had happened. And it obviously was not strictly a laboratory issue, but was a more of a system issue. Well, one of the tools that can be used for this kind of evaluation is a root cause analysis using a diagram such as this called a fishbone diagram. And this looks at and requires that we ask several kinds of questions. Were there team or social factors involved? Were there communication factors, labeling, unlabeling? Were there factors involved in the process? Were there individual factors involved with the patient, the nurse, the surgeon? Or were there education or training issues involved? Was the nurse a new trainee? Did she not know that she should do this? Were there equipment issues? Were there working conditions issues, such as the time between patients or the particular system they were using for labeling? Those kinds of things became worthy of asking. And using this kind of a diagram can be very useful. Inherently, however, we're human, and we have to be thinking about how we're going to manage human error. Fatigue. Humans become fatigued, and therefore working conditions and timeframes are appropriate to evaluate. We can be incomplete in our overall knowledge of things, the circumstances, the world's knowledge, and so forth. Sometimes training is inadequate or incomplete. Sometimes we have memory lapses. Sometimes we make faulty decisions on the basis of either that incomplete knowledge or even on the best knowledge. We may choose awry. Additionally, we're subject to emotions, and those can often cloud decision-making circumstances. We become angry, or communication issues. Many times we've seen circumstances where people were emotionally labile, and so people feared telling such a person that something was going wrong or so forth, and that led to further error. And finally, our very senses and sometimes mislead us. Our eyes or ears can sometimes be incomplete in what they report to our brain. So knowing that these sorts of human errors are certain, we need to realize that any system that relies on human senses and decisions will inevitably fail. And it does so at actually quite predictable rates, but not at entirely predictable times. So because of that, we have to take into account the human factors and endeavor as much as possible to design out those kinds of decisions or settings where a human incomplete knowledge, training, memory lapse, et cetera, can impact the overall outcome. Now, let me give you an example of where this has happened. The Ebola virus outbreak that came to this state some years ago it illustrates some of these principles. So in order to care for an Ebola patient within a hospital setting, extraordinary measures need to be taken to limit the exposure risk of the workers who are around that patient until their viral load has dropped to a point at which they're no longer infectious. So those extraordinary procedures involved a very strict regimen of personal protective equipment that needed to be put on and taken off in a very precise order. Additionally, when these patients were being evaluated with these extraordinary measures, it was evident that this became very tiring, and because of concern about fatigue, they actually limited the time frame at which an individual worker could be on duty in that patient's room. And their choice was 2 hours to reduce the risk of mistakes due to fatigue. Additionally, in both the observation through the room and in observation of their donning and doffing, taking off their personal protective equipment, a particular safety officer monitored their performance to essentially go through the checklist to make sure that they did it entirely correctly, again, to mitigate the risk. And additionally, as you see here, they perform training in their protective equipment to ensure that they could handle the kinds of procedures that they would have to do while they had on this protective equipment. Well, that's very important to recognize that these standard operating procedures, whether that's for managing a patient in the ICU or performing a simple lab test like a viral or like a culture or a histologic exam evaluation, needs to follow certain standard operating procedures. The contents of these procedures are variable, but in the laboratory usually have these particular components. And importantly, they need to be readily available to staff. The staff need to be familiar with and competency developed prior to performing or following that procedure. They need to be reviewed regularly and updated as appropriate. And additionally, they need to be access controlled so that not just anyone can come in and edit or change the procedure. Well, one of the areas where high risks and high damages are potentially involved is in the airline industry. And the airline industry has pioneered the use or certainly widely adopted the use of checklists as a means of ensuring that all of the safety measures, all of the systems needed for proper and safe operation of the airplane, delivery of its contents and cargo, its passengers, etc., was performed safely. Needless to say, this knowledge and this practice, or perhaps unfortunately to say, this grew out of some unfortunate experiences where various technical, personal, or other issues were not identified or addressed in a timely manner, and that resulted in disastrous consequences. In pathology, we use checklists in a variety of ways. There's a checklist, for example, for reporting certain types of cancer resection specimens, or there are certain checklists for setting up or starting up a new piece of equipment. There may be pre-procedure checklists for things like cytology or other kinds of procedures that may be involved. And that can include the so-called timeout point at which you verify that the right patient, right procedure, right site are being handled, and that there are no extraneous materials belonging to any other patient in that suite that could potentially lead to a contamination error. So these are particularly useful for complex processes or complex reporting issues where the data and our memories are liable to be insufficient. Well, another area where we are able to mitigate risk is by sharing that risk. And this is particularly true in a financial sense. This is the whole basis for insurance that allows a large number of people who may have in common a certain risk to pool that risk, contribute to the costs and remediation that it may be experienced by any one member of that pool. So types of insurance that can be of value in the laboratory include, of course, general liability insurance for any procedural negligence or injury to patients or staff through that type of incident. Officers and directors insurance may be important for the various officers to take on and mitigate risks there. There may be the need for property and casualty insurance for equipment, for the physical plant, and so forth. And potentially also for fiscal malfeasance. Health insurance for your employees and so forth to cover occupational injury and so forth. And of course, professional liability insurance to cover errors leading to patient injury that are the result of professional negligence or malpractice. Well, let's just think about what the potential outcomes of risk mitigation efforts might be. So one such uh, tool that was used in a laboratory that I'm familiar with was to install a specimen tracking system using radio frequency identification markers, or RFID markers. And these were intended to be used from the point of origin of the sample and followed through the entire process of the specimen. Um, of course, there are various types of systems and so forth that can be used, but the experience was that by using this type of system from the very beginning of the obtaining the sample, they were able to reduce lost and delayed specimens. They were able to increase the speed of processing due to the fact that there were fewer delays, and they didn't have to do duplicate entry because they had a positively identified specimen, patient identification, and so forth. And that led to reduced patient complaints, reduce repeat procedures, reduce staff time to manage those sorts of things, and an increase in client and patient satisfaction. So those are just some of the sorts of things that come from one such risk management effort. Another procedural change that has been employed in many laboratories is the shift from batch processing to a single piece flow processing for specimen evaluation. We employed this in our histology laboratory and found that we were able to essentially eliminate any risk of cross-contaminations or mislabeling, such as happened with our prostate cancer example earlier. That led to an increase in clinician confidence and also made the efficiency of case assembly and processing much greater. So the staff workload to evaluate contaminated specimens or to track down the issues related to this were reduced, and we didn't have to do genetic evaluation on stray pieces of tissue because of this in our laboratory. So that gives you some idea of just how on the small scale these processes can reduce risk and enhance the operation of your laboratory. I hope that this discussion's been useful for you and will help you in your development of a risk management plan, identifying, hunting down your risks, and knocking them down, or at least managing them in a way that will boost your performance, your financial stability, and increase the patient satisfaction and quality of outcomes. So until next time, thanks so much for joining me. And if you're interested, look up some of those other videos on lab management. I have a playlist on my channel if you'd like to see that. And of course, click that subscribe button and you'll get notice when future videos are released from our operation. Thanks again.